This is Dr. S. the Legend. He's back. We're going to talk about some current event issues. We're going to start with the indictment of James Comey, former FBI director. He was indicted in Virginia because that's where he testified in 2020 when there was a COVID lockdown. And I'm really upset about this. I think I might start crying because Mr. Comey got indicted. Oh, boy. The drama. Well, what did anybody expect? This is a guy who got fired by Donald Trump, and he's endlessly called for Donald Trump to be locked up, arrested, and have the key thrown away. And now there's seeming retaliation by Donald Trump and Donald Trump's Justice Department. Did anybody not expect this? Donald Trump was indicted 4 times and almost forced into bankruptcy in New York State. I said at the time when these things happen that there would probably be retaliation eventually by him or the Republicans if things reversed. What normally happens if one party engages in excessive behavior, it usually backfires, and then the other political party retaliates. More importantly, you cannot lock up your political opposition. If you try to do this, which took place in addition to the 4 indictments and the civil case in New York, 2 impeachments, then you become a banana republic. You lose any concept of being a real democracy. Now, with the seeming retaliation, and there's probably going to be other indictments, Trump's opponents and the Democrats, they don't like it. They're crying foul. What hypocrites. Oh, let me get my tissue again. I think I'm going to have a nervous breakdown here because I'm so upset about this. Now, Trump supporters expect this. In addition, a number of Trump's associates were indicted, prosecuted, and locked up. And now his opponents, who are crying foul, they want Trump to turn the other cheek. That's crazy. Now, there was a Chinese philosopher who I've studied. His name is Sun Tzu. He wrote a book called The Art of War. This is 2,000 years old. And he says, basically, don't go to war. But if you go to war, know your opponent, know his pluses and minuses, and your own. Otherwise, again, don't go to war. For example, how did this work out for Japan and Germany when they went to war against the United States? Politics, in many respects, is like war. Trump's enemies, or the people who didn't like him, didn't anticipate the outcomes of the 4 indictments in the civil fraud case in New York by Attorney General Letitia James. They got sloppy. They left a trail of documents. They got overconfident. And when Biden won, that was their opportunity to file all of these indictments and the civil fraud case in New York. As an attorney for almost 40 years of experience, my legal opinion is I think all of these were just simply a way to lock up Donald Trump and to bankrupt him. They underestimated Donald Trump. Again, using Sun Tzu's philosophy. You have to understand your opponent's pluses and minuses. Now they're accusing Trump of being Hitler. And his supporters, his MAGA supporters, of being Nazis. And ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, federal officers, accusing them of being Gestapo. And I'll talk about the Gestapo a little bit later. Now I want to review, for the record, the cases that were presented against Donald Trump in no particular order. First, there was the Florida documents case. And the issue was, does Donald Trump keep his presidential documents, or do they go to the National Archives? Now, I'm familiar with the National Archives. And simply, if the National Archives got these documents, these presidential documents, they were going to simply put the documents, file them away somewhere. Nobody at the time said, where are the documents going to go? And why shouldn't Donald Trump keep his presidential records? President Biden had classified documents in many locations, and Donald Trump had classified documents. You have to understand something about classified documents. There are millions and millions of classified documents all over the place in Washington and elsewhere because there's no settled program for declassifying documents. So they remain classified, and we've got several 100,000 classified documents from World War II floating around. They're not particularly important. So what happened in the documents case, the FBI sent numerous agents down from Washington, D.C. They were basically SWAT. They came with fully automatic weapons, about a dozen of them, and they raided Mar-a-Lago, Trump's home, down in Florida. To the best of my knowledge, they ransacked Donald Trump's bedroom, his wife's bedroom, his son's bedroom, and many of the other areas of Mar-a-Lago. Documents were photographed, provided to the media. So the question is, how would you feel if this was done to you? How would you feel if this was done to your spouse and your child? Would you be expected to turn the other cheek? You have to understand, it's going to sound a little weird, the mafia had a rule. They could whack each other, but you left family and children and spouses out of it. You never touched them. So I think the ransacking of Mar-a-Lago, particularly Melania Trump's bedroom and some Barron's bedroom, this was just over the top. To make a long story short, the judge in the case, the documents case, which was in Florida, threw the case out. She said the prosecutor, Jack Smith, was illegally appointed because to be a prosecutor, he wasn't part of the Justice Department, he was a special prosecutor, he had to be appointed by the president, and he wasn't appointed by the president. And if you're appointed by the president, you also have to be confirmed by the Senate, and this never happened. So basically, she said he was a rogue prosecutor, and she threw the case out. Let me talk about the New York State case, a civil case, a mortgage fraud case brought by Attorney General Letitia James in New York State. He was accused of overvaluing his properties in order to obtain loans or mortgages. Again, this was a civil case and not a criminal case. And in this case, the judge fined Donald Trump almost $500 million and banned him and his sons from running the Trump organization. He granted them an injunction and prohibited them from running the organization for a number of years. The bank that lent the money to Donald Trump said that there was no fraud. Nothing happened. They made a lot of money. You have to understand what Donald Trump and his organization did. They wanted to get a loan. They valued their property. Then the bank comes along and they valued the property. And they go with the valuation that the bank uses, not the one that Donald Trump uses. But in any case, the Attorney General decided to launch the civil fraud case against Donald Trump. So, to make a long story short, Donald Trump appealed the case to the appeals court, and the 5 judges in the appeals case, in this case, threw the case out. They said it was a violation of the 8th Amendment. The 8th Amendment says no excessive fines. He was being fined almost $500 million. The Supreme Court ruled in 2019, 9-0, written by Judge Ginsburg, that you cannot have excessive fines. So the law is very clear. You have to remember with a fine, the money goes to the government, and what's the government going to do with it? If they fine Donald Trump for $500 million, what's the state of New York going to do with the money? The ironic problem, the case is on further appeal to the highest court in New York on the issue of the injunction, but I'm sure in the end, even if the case gets reversed and gets to the United States Supreme Court, they're going to throw the whole thing out because of a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which says no excessive fines. And $500 million is in excessive fines. In the case of, in 2019, it was merely a $40,000 fine. So there's a bit of a problem for Letitia James right now, because there's allegations she's the prosecutor that she engaged in fraud herself by having multiple homes and obtaining mortgages where she said that the mortgages were her primary residence. When you get a mortgage, you can only get one mortgage at a good rate for your primary residence. Your secondary and your vacation home residence, they have to pay a higher mortgage rate. Well, supposedly she didn't do this. So it looks like there's a high probability she's going to get indicted, probably in Virginia. And if this civil fraud case gets thrown out, there's a high probability that Donald Trump is going to sue Letitia James for wrongful prosecution. I wouldn't be surprised he likes to do this. It's not, what do they say in sports? It's not over till it's over, and it's not over yet. Now I want to go through the District of Columbia case against Donald Trump for January 6th. I'm not going to go. He was indicted for four different charges, again by prosecutor Jack Smith. So on July 1st, 2024, the United States Supreme Court granted Donald Trump presidential immunity, basically for what happened on January 6th. The ironic thing was Jack Smith sort of ignored the Supreme Court ruling, and on August 27th, 2024, Smith simply refiled the four charges. The case should have been dismissed. Then Donald Trump wins the election in November 5th, this past year, because now he's the president, and you can't have a criminal case proceed while the president is in office. Now Jack Smith is being investigated, and he could have been illegally appointed. Again, he wasn't appointed by Joe Biden, and he wasn't confirmed by the Senate. Then there's the Atlanta case, an election case against Donald Trump and approximately 25 others in Atlanta, Georgia, over the Georgia election, filed by District Attorney Willis, and she brought on her boyfriend, Mr. Wade, and paid him $1 gazillion. And she got in trouble for this. And the trial court took her off the case, and recently the Georgia Supreme Court permanently took her off the case, and it remains to be seen what will happen, whether she could lose her law license, she could be prosecuted criminally, so could her boyfriend, Mr. Wade. And to make a long story short, this was a federal election case. This belongs in federal court. This does not belong in the court in Atlanta, Georgia. All cases, you have to remember, all these election cases, they're always civil cases, meaning, worst comes to worst, you get a fine. President Obama was fined $1 million for irregularities in campaign financing when he ran for president. So now the state of Georgia passed Senate Bill 244. It's called Title 17-11-6A. Let me just briefly read to you what it says, and I'll interpret it. In the event that the prosecuting attorney in a felony or misdemeanor criminal case is disqualified due to improper conduct on the part of such prosecuting attorney, and such criminal case is dismissed by the court or a subsequent prosecutor tasked with prosecuting such case following such disqualification, any defendant against whom such charges are dismissed shall be entitled to an award of all reasonable attorney's fees and costs incurred by the defendant in defending the case. The state of Georgia now is going to be giving Donald Trump the right, assuming this case is permanently closed, to get his attorney's fees and his costs for this case paid by, I would assume, by Atlanta, Georgia. This is now the law in Georgia. I want to talk about the Manhattan case filed by District Attorney Bragg. He didn't prosecute the case. He brought in a federal prosecutor to try the case of Manhattan. And Donald Trump was found guilty of improper record keeping of payments in the 2016 election. Now, he was found guilty. But he got no sentence. He got no probation. He got no prison. He got nothing. I've never seen this happen. Supposedly, in the state of New York, you can be found guilty and nothing happens to you. Amazing. Now, this case is on appeal. This case should have never been brought again in Manhattan because it's a federal election case. If anything, it would belong in federal court. It shouldn't be a criminal case. It should be a civil case. Simply, worst comes to worst, you get a fine. This case is on appeal, and I guarantee you, if it's not thrown out at the New York appeals level, it'll be thrown out at the federal level. I want to switch gears and talk about those terms I discussed previously, the issue of Hitler, the Nazis, and Gestapo. People have no idea what these things are. Gestapo is an acronym. It stands for Geheime Stadtpolizei. Should I do it again in German? Geheime Stadtpolizei. Basically, it means German secret police. And the Gestapo is being equated with ICE officers who are trying to detain and deport people that don't belong here. And people use this term and they have no idea what the Gestapo was and what they did. First of all, they didn't have uniforms. They operated in the middle of the night when they took people into custody. They didn't wear masks. You have to understand, in Germany at the time, in Nazi Germany, there were at the minimum 300 concentration camps. At the conclusion of World War II, we discovered there was over 1 million people that died in these concentration camps, and about 500,000 survived. Most of the people that were sent to these camps were sent there by the Gestapo. Then we have the 6 death camps in Poland. These were extermination camps for almost entirely the Jewish population, in which 2 to 4 million people died. They were gassed and then they were cremated. The Gestapo was largely responsible for organizing and sending people to both the concentration camps and the death camps. And these are just simply estimates. The Gestapo operated not only in Germany and Austria, but all through the areas that were conquered by the German army. They punished civilians who undermined the war effort. They also were behind what was known as Einsatzgruppen, another German word. This was before the death camps. This was an organized mass shooting and mobile gassing of 2 million Jews in the Soviet Union. They also organized all the slave labor camps in Germany and all the occupied areas. And again, they sent everyone to the death camps in Poland, some of the names you're familiar with, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and many of the people in the Gestapo were tried after the war as war criminals, and several hundred of them were executed. So you're having ICE agents, government-appointed people, being equated with the Gestapo. And I guarantee you 99.9% of the people have no idea what the Gestapo did. How utterly evil they were. And these people should be ashamed of themselves by even using the term Gestapo or equating Donald Trump as Hitler. He started a war in which like 75 million people died. I mean, this is just total irresponsibility. Let me talk about what the ICE people do and the whole process from a legal point of view, because people don't understand this. There's something called the law, and no one is above the law. Hello? It's totally legal for government officials to question people about their citizenship. There's a law. It's called 8 U.S.C. 1357 A1. And it's based on what is called reasonable suspicion. And the Supreme Court reinforced this recently in September 8th in a 6-3 decision by Justice Kavanaugh. So if you actually are a citizen and they question you and for some reason you feel abused in some way, you can always sue the government. But all they need is what's called reasonable suspicion. We also have another statute, 8 U.S.C. 1324. It's illegal to harbor an illegal alien. Not only harboring them, but bringing them into the United States, transporting them within the United States. So, in any case, this is totally legal to do this. You have to remember, there's precedent involved with this. After World War II, it was discovered that there were about 5 million Mexicans had come into the country during World War II, and prior to that, they were illegal, and President Truman signed an executive order, and they began deporting them. There were no protests, there were no demonstrations, and this system of deportation continued in the late 1940s and into the 1950s under the administration of Dwight Eisenhower. And all 5 million people were deported. They were non-citizens and they didn't belong in the United States. And there was no demonstration. And there were no sanctuary cities. There were no sanctuary states. Let me just be clear about what we're talking about here. We have a system of law. And again, nobody's above the law. The highest law in the United States is the Constitution. Then comes federal law. Then comes state and local law. And we have something called preemption. And in preemption, the Constitution's first, then federal law is above state and local law. If states and local governments pass laws in contradiction to federal law, it's unconstitutional. We call that nullification. And I may have covered this before. Nullification was decided in the 19th century with what was called the Tariff Issue of 1832. And by the way, we had something called the Civil War, where the southern states decided to nullify the Union. And President Lincoln said, you couldn't do this. You're not allowed to do this. And as a result, nullification was permanently decided. You have to also understand, let me just describe again what I'm talking about with these sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. They are saying, like some have been very vocal, Illinois, California, Massachusetts, what's happening up in Oregon, they don't want to follow the federal law. They don't want to cooperate with the federal government in investigating and possibly deporting people that are here illegally. And they pass laws saying that they're not going to cooperate with the federal government in a process of deportation. The problem is, it's illegal. It's unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court is going to be ruling on this very shortly. And then the issue becomes is, I'm sure they're going to rule, and I'm sure they're going to rule in favor of the United States federal government. And what's going to happen? Are they going to allow the federal government to stop sending federal money to these states, to these sanctuary cities? I don't get it. I don't understand why we even have sanctuary cities or sanctuary states, because we're in violation of that statute, 8 U.S.C. 1324, harboring illegal aliens. You can't harbor them. And by the way, it's criminal. And the penalty is 10 years imprisonment. And it can be more depending on the situation. So again, it remains to be seen what's going to happen. And certain states, certain cities are accusing the federal government as operating as a Gestapo. And they don't have any idea what a Gestapo is or what that organization was in Nazi Germany. You have to also remember, once the war ended in Germany, we occupied Germany almost for 10 years. Well, we still have troops there, by the way, but we occupied them and we had to denazify them. We had to de-brainwash them because they were so demented, their thought processes had been so ruined that it took us about 10 years until we felt confident that we could allow them self-rule and democracy. And we kept a lot of troops there for a long period of time. So I have a feeling that there are people in the United States, even people in government, in the sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, that either for political reasons or other reasons, they're trying to brainwash the population and to believe somehow the federal government is acting as the Gestapo and that Donald Trump is the equivalent of Adolf Hitler. It's just irresponsible, and it doesn't help the situation. It makes the situation worse. This is Dr. S, the legend, and keep in mind, this is who I am, Conversations with Dr. S, the legend. This is how you can contact me. So let me just hang up my cue cards here. This is who I am. And any questions and problems, feel free to contact me with anything that I've said. This is Dr. S, the legend, signing off.